Alright guys, welcome to how to clean your airbrush. This is a very common question that I get asked, and it's also a very common problem that I see a lot of artists, not putting the time into properly cleaning their gun, and it causes a lot of issues. And if you just do a couple simple things, it can save you a lot of headache down the road. So the first thing we're going to go over is the supplies that I use. Here I have my airbrush that has been put through some regular work. It's not as heavy as a full night's work, but I did do a look with it and it should work well for showing you guys how to clean this. And as you can see, it's just a little bit dirty. I do use alcohol-based makeup, and to clean alcohol, you're going to need alcohol. So this is 99% isopropyl alcohol. You have to order this online. I haven't seen any stores that carry 99%. I'm sure there's some legal reason for it, but just go online, look up 99%, and you should be able to find it fairly easy. It's not super expensive, and it's really the only way to clean your airbrush. The next material is whatever kind of a wipe you're going to use to wipe out your airbrush. Now currently I only have toilet paper on demand right now, which I know is a hot commodity nowadays, but you can use napkins. Paper towels work pretty much the best. They're just a little more abrasive, but it's what I have on hand and it works for this purpose. Alright, this next one's a little bit of a tool. It is this. It's a little bit of a pipe cleaner. This one's made specifically for airbrushes, but a regular pipe cleaner works as well. This just gets in some of those small areas, and you can see down this center tube here, it's nice to clean out some of those bits that you might miss normally. Alright, this last supply is optional, but it's for if your airbrush is on its last leg or you really need to flush out a type of paint. Say you have used water-based and you need to put alcohol. You need to make sure you thoroughly clean that in between, and sometimes alcohol won't wash that all out. So, a good tip I learned from Alan Hops is carburetor and choke parts cleaner. Now this seems oddly weird and you would think it would be super abrasive to the airbrush, but a carburetor is a bunch of small working metal parts that needs to be cleaned out, and an airbrush is relatively the same. So if you take this and just spray a little bit in the cup and run it through your gun, I promise you this stuff will eliminate any problems you have. It is the end all be all, like, premium solution. Do not do this inside though. This stuff is toxic, so make sure you're in a well ventilated area, but this stuff does work very well. I also wouldn't recommend putting this through your gun every single time you use the airbrush or every time you're trying to clean out paint. This is just good to do every once in a while as sort of a reset button on your airbrush. And a quick honorable mention that is also pretty optional is Q-tips. Q-tips can help you get into some of the smaller spaces, but they're not really necessary, and I won't be using them today, just because I don't have any on hand and I don't find them incredibly necessary. Alright, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to break down my airbrush and kind of explain my process with doing that. So the first step, obviously, is taking off this guard in the back. Now, this doesn't really need to be cleaned. If it gets sticky here, you can clean it, but it's not really necessary. If this gets gummed up, you've seriously made a big mistake and you really need to clean out your airbrush, but there shouldn't be paint back here for any reason. Next, you're going to take off this little nut, and this little nut basically just secures the needle within the gun. Now you're going to pull the needle out, and you can tell that is really gummed up. The needle is something that I clean most often. Usually, every time before I use my airbrush, regardless if I've run paint through it or not, I will clean the needle because it can cause you a lot of problems. Next, I'm going to unscrew this back end. Now this back end houses the guide for the needle. This also shouldn't have a ton of paint in it. It also holds this little lever piece. Now this little lever piece is kind of tricky. You want to make sure this is not gummed up because this actually pushes against your trigger right here. And if this is gummed up, your airbrush will not snap back into its original form and you might have inconsistencies within your painting. So it's good to just check that, swab this over once, just make sure it's not gummy. Next, we will pull out the trigger. The trigger is another area where you're going to make sure it is not gummed up. It gets gummed up in this part quite often if paint comes back into the barrel at all. So just giving that a quick wipe down can help avoid a lot of those problems as well. So that's it for the back end. This is completely empty as far as parts go. So we're gonna run into the front end here. This end cap here, this end cap here does get paint collected in it. It's not too detrimental, but it can be if there's a lot of paint in it. So taking a Q-tip or just a small piece of cloth and wiping that out is good every once in a while. Now this front is where a lot of the gumming up happens. This is where your needle actually presses through for the final time before it leaves your gun. So you can see I have some gunk on there right now, but it's nice to keep this really clean as well. Alright, this little wrench comes standard in pretty much all airbrush kits. Now, you might not know what this is for, or you might just toss it, but it is actually important to keep this. As you can see, I couldn't unscrew that with my fingers, and that's because I will actually tighten this piece with this wrench, because air runs directly into this point through this little hole right here. So, you want to get that on as tight as you can and create as nice of a seal as possible. Now, this front end cone here is actually another front guide for your needle. And you can tell that point is very, very, very small. This is a part you want to be super careful with. First of all, if you drop it on the ground, it's super easy to lose. Also, I ruined my first Iwata by bending this tip here. And once you bend this tip, the needle can't correctly guide through it, and it causes so many problems and a lot of headache. This piece actually comes off. It's not quite wiggling for me. This piece actually comes off. I don't want to try and do that on camera because, like I said, I don't want to break this piece, but it does come off and you need to clean out the inside of that. But once you get that off, it is pretty much stripped down and you just have your empty casing. All right, now you can see we have all of our wonderful interior bits. So I'm just going to quickly show you how I clean each of these pieces. Alright, so we're going to start with the needle here. What I like to do is just fold up a piece of paper towel or toilet paper. I fold it up once and then I actually give it a half fold just so there's a nice bit of padding there. And then I'll take my alcohol and I'll spray it all along the side of this here. That way you have a nice area where you can just pick up your needle, press it in, and I give it a little bit of a roll just to kind of get some abrasion going, and then pull, and then make sure you're going on another clean spot, and keep repeating this. And there's some places, you can see on my needle here, there's still a little at the tip, which is fine, because then you just go in and wipe that off until that is entirely clean. Be very careful with this. You do not want to bend the tip of this needle at all. It will cause you problems. So when you're cleaning, make sure you're just being gentle, coming at everything from the side, not going straight down, and you'll avoid a lot of those problems. This cap is pretty easy. There's usually not a ton of paint in this bad boy, but I will give it a spray down in there and just kind of let that paint come through. You can blow through it usually. That's what I do. Give it a quick blow, make sure everything gets out of it, but it's usually not too gunky. And then, like I said, just make sure this tip is clear. So giving that a wipe off. We just had a little residue come off of that, and so you just want to make sure that is clean. Alright, so for our tiny end cap piece here, I am going to show you guys what this tool does. So I'm going to take a little bit of alcohol and just spray it in there, get it a little wet. And I'm going to take my little pipe cleaner here and I'm just going to run that through a couple of times. And that should be enough to really scrub out all of the paint particles. Alright, now this back housing here is actually 3 pieces. So you have the part that screws into the gun, you have a spring that keeps everything compact, and then you have this needle guide with our lever on the front. Now this does get gummed up a little bit sometimes, so you're going to want to do the same thing with cleaning on that. Like I said, just take some alcohol, get that on the end there nice and wet, and then just give this guy a little rub down. There shouldn't be a ton of paint back here. If there is, you know, just clean thoroughly, but there shouldn't be a ton. You just want to make sure everything's not sticky. And then, like I said, this piece can get gummed up a little bit, so I like to dabble over that, as well as go over it with my pipe cleaner, and that should help get in those nooks and crannies and make sure our lever is working perfectly fine. As with this piece, you saw there was a little bit of paint here, a little bit of residue, and that actually sits right inside here. So you're going to want to do the same thing of just cleaning out the inside of this. So I'm gonna give it a little nudge of alcohol and then go in with my pipe cleaner again and really scrub that out. Like I said, shouldn't be a ton of paint in there, but it is a good thing to check. Last but not least is our trigger. And like I said, we do need to hit that just a tiny bit, just to make sure it's not all gummed up. So we're taking our cloth, putting some alcohol on it, and just hitting where that joint is. Because this part actually presses down on your air, and you don't want that to be gummed up because you need it to interact with how far you pulled the lever back. So you really want to make sure you clean that. Another place paint usually gets is underneath this. This isn't a huge deal. It's just something that I like to do just to make the airbrush look a little nicer and feel a bit cleaner. So I put these front pieces back on because we already have them cleaned and I want to protect that really intricate part. So that's why that's still on. But you can see there's a lot of paint around my cup and down inside the cup. Now, down inside the cup, this is a bad place where things do get gunked up a lot because your needle blocks it, you know, when you're wiping it out with anything else. So you are going to make sure you want to clean that little area down there, that little well, while the needle's not in it, so you can effectively get a nice clean. This little well is probably the only area where a Q-tip will dramatically make your life better, but it is possible without a Q-tip, and I'll show you how. So usually what I do is I just fill it just a tiny bit with alcohol, and then bunch up a tissue and really work it down in there. There's no intricate parts, so feel free to use some elbow grease and really get around in there, because see how much comes up off of that? That is a ton of paint. So then going in again, being a little more precise, making sure to really get down there. All right. Okay. So that's already looking a ton better. More of it will be cleaned out once we actually shoot stuff through the airbrush, but for right now, that's pretty good. So for the purpose of this video, I'm not going to clean the exterior of the cup. It's pretty self-explanatory. The only thing I will mention is down here in this little crease, there does have paint pile up. And it's not a performance issue, but just to keep your gun feeling fresh, you can take a tool and go in and really get into those nooks and crannies, just to have your airbrush feeling nice. But it's not essential. Now this back housing is, in my opinion, probably the hardest part of the airbrush to clean. A Q-tip will also help you a lot in this back area, but again, it's not essential. The only thing that's saving you is there's not a ton of paint past the cup, because paint feeds in here, gets shot with air, and gets propelled out. So the only time you have backsplash is when you cover the tip, or if something goes wrong and there's a loose air leak. So there's not a ton of paint, but it is still a little bit difficult to clean. So usually what I do is I give a couple shots down, and then I will take my pipe cleaner tool and I will run that inside, rotating it a little bit, giving it some help, making sure that those areas get clean. And there's a little bit of paint that comes out, but again, not a ton. Another area you'll want to clean is straight down onto your PSI trigger, your pressure trigger. Just spray some alcohol there, because sometimes it can get gummed up. So let that do its work. Give it a good scrub out. And then, you know, dump it into a trash can, obviously. But that's about all you have to do for the back. If you have issues with your trigger, you'll want to do this again. Alright folks, now it's time for reassembly. This, depending on your airbrush, can be not as difficult or it can be super difficult. What I mean by that is mainly the trigger and the lever. It can get a little tricky. With Iwata, it's not too hard, but it is still a difficult process. So the first thing you're going to want to do is take your trigger, and if you're confused which way the trigger goes in, whether it sits like this or this, you can usually tell because there's a divot underneath. I don't know if you can see on this side, but there should be a divot where it can comfortably fit when it's pressed back onto the airbrush. So that's the side you're going to want in the back. But this just takes a little finesse. You're going to want to go straight down and hit that PSI switch. What I was doing is that small dangly bit, trying to guide that straight down first onto our pressure pin, because the airbrush trigger actually does sit a little bit forward. it's leaning just a little bit, so it's hard if you try to put it in sideways because physics don't work like that. So trying to get that pin straight on until it sets in there and then leaning it forward. And you should know you've got it if it does lean forward a little bit and you can press it down. So you have your trigger in there. The next thing you're going to want to do is reassemble this back housing. So you're going to take your lever piece, slide that spring right on there, and then put this piece over it. Now the lever can be tricky if this part is not attached to this. Luckily on Iwata's they are, so it doesn't give me a lot of troubles, but I know on a Harbor Freight they aren't, and it was a lot trickier to get this piece positioned. But what you want to do is make sure it is slid all the way up and it goes forward. If you have it forward just like this, it will not fit. And if you have it backwards, you're not going to be able to push it through and then pull it back up again. So, like I said, you're going to want to make sure it's up and forward, just like that. And then you're just going to slide that with a little bit of an angle and then reach it up, and you can see it is sitting right behind our trigger, and that's how we want it. And then just screw that in there, and that should provide the tension that you need. All right, there we go. Once you get that all screwed in, you'll see that the lever works as it should. The next thing you're gonna wanna do is guide your needle into this back piece. Now this is an area where you do have to be careful because you really don't want to bend the end of your needle. So, softly guiding it in, I use the tip of my finger just a little bit as a bounce pad to kind of help it guide, so I'm not directly stabbing the end of that or anything, but it's not necessarily too hard. As long as you're going slow with it, you shouldn't mess anything up too bad. So our needle is in there. It slides all the way through. Usually I put it in pretty slowly because if this happens to be out of place, you could end up stabbing that. It's just a lot easier to take things slow and make sure that your needle does not get bent. And then just slide the end nut on, tighten that, and then you can slide your back cap on. There you have it, folks. That is my complete teardown, cleaning, and reassembly. That's what I do pretty much every time I reuse my airbrush. It is not essential to do this every single time you pick up your airbrush, but it is good to do every couple of times. You don't have to worry about cleaning every piece of your airbrush all the time, but some things you do need to clean probably every time you pick up the airbrush is checking and making sure this front housing is not full of paint, because that can block your paint from coming out and cause a lot of issues. You are going to want to clean out this cup, because if you can't get paint into your airbrush, you're going to run into more consistencies. So just checking and making sure that is clean. What I like to do is spray some alcohol behind the lever and the trigger, and then pulling it forward like this and spraying some in front. Because sometimes you'll notice that this gets sticky and your lever will get stuck back or it'll get stuck down. So you just want to make sure all of those parts are working cleanly. And then of course, about every time I use my airbrush, I am going to clean the needle, just because it also causes a lot of problems if it's sticky, stuff like that. But that's pretty much all you have to worry about on a day-to-day basis. So the full teardown, everything, is just to do every once in a while, or if you notice performance issues in your gun. I cannot stress enough how important cleaning your airbrush is. I know it's easy as artists to kind of put it to the side or not want to do it after a long makeup session or a long night at the haunt, but you really, really need to do it, because the more that paint dries in there, the worse it is going to be on the back end for you to clean out, or it just might be non-recoverable if it is bad enough. Like I said, you don't have to do these things every time, but at the end of the night, make sure you're going through your essentials, cleaning that out so the least amount of dried paint gets in there for the next time you pick up your airbrush and start using it again. Alright guys, that's going to be pretty much it for my cleaning tutorial. If you have a different model or you have specific questions about anything, go ahead and comment below or send me a message on Facebook, and I can try to help you out the best I can. Again, I can't stress this enough. Please, 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 clean your guys' airbrush. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Boston Pettit. BostonPettit.com is my website. It's got my portfolio of all my makeup and stuff. If you have any other questions, feel free to shoot me a message or comment down below. And please consider subscribing, because I will be coming out with a lot of mini videos like this in the future.